Everyone, just to confirm, everyone can see my slides, right? Not my notes.
Right.
That's right. Yeah, it's just like watching a slideshow.
Excellent. So welcome everyone, and apologies in advance for any banging that are going on above my head. This is the quietest spot I could find. And so we have an hour, and so there are parts of this that I can quite easily move through at a quicker pace because the presentations so far have been phenomenal and everything is so well aligned and integrated and fits together so well. It's super exciting. So congratulations, Patsy, on what is already a fabulous event, despite the technical glitches. We will overcome. So I think one takeaway for me from all the presentations so far is really the importance of shifting our focus from young people themselves, from children and youth themselves, to think about the broader community. We really need to put much greater emphasis on how we're supporting whole families. And of course, how we're going to best support whole families really is how do we support the communities in which families, children and youth find themselves. And so that's the focus of my presentation today is on communities that care. How do we promote them? In essence, how do we promote community resilience in order to better support child and youth resilience? And so if I can get my slides to move on. There we go. I think another thing that we've really heard a lot of today, and I know there was a lot of discussion about this in our roundtables discussion, is that, sorry, I can't actually see my notes because there we go, is the ways in which our communities and our service provision structures have been shaped. For me, looking at this in the past few years, a lot of this has to do with neoliberal policies. So the emergence of this, especially in the late 70s and the early 80s, has had a very profound impact on our policies, and policies impact service provision. And so what we see there is that there's been a huge impact on individualization of risk, responsibility, and reward. So from our schools to our mental health services, all the way through to youth criminal justice and even the adult justice system, really focuses quite exclusively on the individual and holds the individual very responsible for how they're doing. Combined with this, we've seen a huge introduction of market competition, where public services are assessed as if they're for-profit services, which really doesn't work. And I think, again, I've heard a lot of this throughout this session so far, that we really need to be taking much more of a grassroots, top-up approach and adapting resources to meet individual community needs and the needs of the families and children living there. And then the third impact of this is the use of standardized monitoring and evaluation frameworks to gauge outcomes, which is interesting because if we think about the panel discussion this morning, where I have names here, where Mayor Dawn Arnold was talking about the importance of data, I think we can all absolutely agree with that. But I think the researchers in the group and the way we share findings to impact this emphasis on standardized monitoring and evaluation frameworks. They're too rigid and they absolutely don't account for the reality on the ground. And the fact that we're implementing services, we could implement the same program or the same service across different contexts and cultures and communities, urban, rural, and there's so many variables that are impacting the ways in which programs are implemented and what we're seeing in terms of outcomes. And our standard monitoring and evaluation frameworks, by and large, don't account for that. So that's a note for the evaluators out there that we need to rethink these frameworks. How do I move along? Simultaneously, we've increased our reliance on professional services, and I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Margaret Wheatley's work. I cite some of her in this workshop today. She's wonderful in saying that we've overcomplicated everything, and really solutions to a lot of what we're dealing with are quite simple. And again, to echo Chief Darlene Bernard, common sense plays a very big role in what we need to do. And when we push for an over-reliance on professional services, what we come up against are definitions of core competencies and service mandates, and again, these policy and funding structures that have a huge impact on the way services are able to function or actually not able to function. So we've turned what were once family and community functions into marketable services provided often at a cost. These services are intended to be globally reproducible, irrespective of culture and context. And again, this doesn't fit well when we start looking at family and community needs. This requirement has amplified the neoliberal benchmarks of outcomes and ironically further restricted what services are able to do. How often are frontline service professionals in a situation where they can see what the need is, but because of their mandates and the regulations that govern them, they're hamstrung and their hands are tied. So this is an unfortunate reality that service providers are bumping up against as well. And then finally, our move towards professionalization that's been so powerfully shaped by neoliberalism has resulted in increasing levels of social isolation, where people have become compartmentalized and the capacity of the collective to support people in need who are struggling with challenges has really been diminished. So as an example, rather than teachers, parents, and community members being able to come together and, for example, and collectively support a young person who's dealing with challenges, we're more often than not relinquish this capacity to professionals. And professionals, again, having to work in silos and coming up against the challenges they face there. So similarly, rather than recognizing the needs of parents and communities for healing and supporting them in meaningful ways, we focus on their failings. And I will say this quite openly. Unfortunately, the notion of resilience and that terminology has really been co-opted in a lot of ways that are used to blame people who are dealing with challenges and just don't have the resources to do that effectively. So I placed my little field completely in the middle of this. As a result of these moves towards professionalization, neoliberalism, social isolation, we've really lost our capacity as a collection of individuals to connect and interact in meaningful ways. And I include frontline professionals in that as well. And I think there's a real need and desire there to be able to. So by compartmentalizing our society, how do we break down these artificial lines to create social networks within communities and networks between communities and formal services and even between formal services? And so that's what we're going to chat about. I'm not sure I had been inspired by Hoover and Zoom and thought we could do all sorts of wonderful things. But in the interests of time, I'm going to just ask if everyone can very briefly say who you are, what do you do, and here please include the sector that you're in. So for example, you work in education, and what level are you at? Frontline, management, policy, or funding? And then if everyone can just think to themselves, don't worry to say this, what do you love to do? What activity or action brings you joy? And if you had one superpower, what would it be and why? And we'll come back to this later in the workshop. So it's that I'm asking this question. So I am trying to see if I can get everybody, I can't actually see, all I can see on my slides at this point. So Patsy, are you still with us?
I am here.
Wonderful. So, if you can see who all's in the group, do you mind facilitating the intros?
Sure.
Thanks.
Yes, Denise is here. And Denise, maybe you could introduce yourself now as
Hello.
Yeah.
So make sure you can hear me. So my name is Denise Josia, and I work for Indigenous Services Canada. I'm with the FINIB branch, which is the First Nations Inuit Health branch. I'm what's called a Community Development Liaison Officer. So what I do is I work in community with health departments in developing and supporting their programs. So my history is I used to work for the school board for the Halifax Regional Center for Education as a Mi'kmaq Indigenous student support worker. And I took a 2-year leave to go and work with the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. So I've got a lot of experience in dealing with grassroots on the ground. I love working with community. I love working with our women and finding safe alternatives to protecting themselves and feeling safe out in our world. So, and if I had a superpower, it would be to probably balance the inequity that we live in our world. So.
Thank you. And you know what, Denise, I'm really happy to meet you. Are you, did you work with Shannon?
Yes, yeah, I did.
And did you take her position, or is it
Oh,
just
no,
interesting?
no.
She just told me she was moving. So
No. So our unit, the First Nations Inuit Health Branch, has a mental wellness unit and also has a community development liaison officer unit. So we do work really closely. But Shannon was the mental wellness director. So yeah, she's left us, and I have done a lot of work in mental health, working grassroots on the ground with families and supporting them.
okay, no, just nice to meet you. Shannon was on our program planning committee, and then
oh, great, yeah, I love her.
Yeah, she was great, and I'm sure you are too. Just be nice to get to know you.
Thank you.
Lisa, Stockton.
Oh, can you hear me?
We can now.
Oh, okay. I've had to join by phone, so I'm just figuring out the audio a bit. So my name is Lisa Stockton, and I'm the Managing Director for the Knowledge Development and Exchange Hub. We're a government-funded, university-based organization, and we aim to improve approaches for mental health promotion for Canadian children and youth. Our main audience is a set of 20 projects that have been funded by the Public Health Agency of Canada's Mental Health Promotion Innovation Fund. So these are some very diverse projects across the country who are all focused on specific populations of children and youth. And so our niche is in service to those 20 projects, but we are also looking to engage with the community across Canada who are focused on mental health promotion more broadly for children and youth.
Just lost you.
Oh, hello.
It's strange. You don't usually lose someone when they call in by phone. Okay. Hopefully she'll come back. Kathy, you want to start in case she's not coming back? Kathy Leslie?
Yeah, I just had to find my unmute button. It was hidden. So I'm Kathy Leslie, and I am on the board of ASI, and I have attended earlier years of ASI in my role, which is with the Nova Scotia Health Authority, but I work in community health promotion and community development, a lot of collaborative work with community-based services and with other levels of like the municipal government. And yeah, and I've done it for a while. And I love to swim. I had the nicest swim yet this year on Sunday, I think it was. And if I had one superpower, I would make the world peaceful.
Mm. Okay, thank you. Chantel.
Hi, I'm Chantel. I'm the Youth Leadership Coordinator for ASI this year, and I'm going to my third year of actually my music degree at Acadia in Nova Scotia, so that's pretty interesting. And I do like music, hence why I also did music. I'm doing a music degree, but I also like to go to the beach, and I think that's a great place to kind of do stuff. And if I had one more superpower, I would try I think flying, that's a common one, but it would be nice to go to PEI and then fly back in the same day.
Fly your own plane. Fun. So Linda, how about you?
So I'm Linda, and I'm an independent academic. So I'm a research and evaluation consultant, and I focus on child and youth resilience. And I've done this work for about 20 years. And the findings of this over the years have really shown me what young people have shared with me over the years. Their wisdom has really highlighted we shouldn't be talking about child and youth resilience. We should be talking about community resilience. And what do I love to do? I love to write. I love stories and I love poetry. And if I had one superpower, I think it would also be to fly. Especially if I could just get on like a magic rug and do it and skip airports and delays, that would be stunning. So I think that would be the superpower I'd want. So I've made a note. Sorry, Patsy.
Do you want to know? I'll just say who I am. I mean, I know you've seen my face, but you don't know me. So I'll just say I'm Patsy Beatty Huggan. I live in Charlottetown. I grew up in Fredericton. Never imagined I'd live on this island, but I married an islander, and the rest is history. People could have told me that ahead of time if I'd only listened, that I would end up being here. He's always wanted to come home. What sector do I work in? I work in a little bit of everything, I think, but I do consulting work, so I work in projects, and all of my projects are really ones that are more building community, where people are working, whether it's in the workplace or it is on working with individuals, it's toward community. So it's just where I tend to go. So, and what do I love to do? I love bringing people together. That probably brings me the most joy, is bringing that ability to reach out and hear what people bring, what they have, and getting people to feel comfortable in the room, like they've come into my home. So that makes me feel really good. And if I had one superpower, I think it would be that I could be doing more things. I just like more hours in the day and more opportunities to do what I love to do. So I have no intention of retiring, and I have a dream that I'm going to be cycling at 94. So there, I got to keep working at it, and that's me. So Lisa, you're back. I think I see a mic there. Maybe not. All right. Oh, there she is.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Do you want to try finishing what you started?
Sure. I'm not sure where you lost me, to be honest.
I think you were down to what you love to do.
Oh, okay. What I like to do, I love to hike. I love to be outdoors. One of my favorite trips was hiking in the Scottish Cairngorms a couple of years ago. It was fantastic and beautiful and such open spaces. Superpower. I'd like all of the ones that were already mentioned, but maybe also invisibility at some times too, to be a bit of a fly on the wall in places where you don't normally get to go.
Oh, neat. Okay. Well, I think you've got a pretty good, thank you for that. And I think you've got a pretty good handle, Linda, on who you have in the room or in this space. Let's put it that way. So I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Definitely. Thank you so much for that, Patsy. I really appreciate it. Now, moving the slides along. So I think we've been at it for about 19 minutes and we've got an hour. So I guess that leaves us with about 40 minutes. If it's okay with everybody, I'm going to scrap the break. That would have given us an extra 5 minutes. And what I'd like for us to do in the next 40 minutes is very quickly, I'll just go over what we know from about 40 years worth of research on child and youth resilience. And then briefly cover what are the implications of this for mental health promotion. And I will go through that very quickly because I think we've heard a lot about that from other speakers already. And then why community resilience? And they're looking specifically at what is it when we talk about community resilience? Also, what is it that we mean when we talk about community or when I talk about community? And then how we foster it. And I do have an activity there, which we'll see how the time goes. I would have loved to have feedback on the model that I'm presenting, but we may have to pick up on some of that through the chat. So we'll just see how we do for time. And I feel like I had another note about this, which I can't remember, so we'll just scoot along. So current understandings of resilience. Research, as I said, from the past 40 years, and this is interdisciplinary research, I should mention. So it's from social work, sociology, psychology, psychiatry, neurobiology, so the whole gamut. What do we know about child and youth resilience and what young people need to achieve better than expected outcomes in the face of non-normative challenges? Footnote, non-normative challenges today is a bit of a misnomer because I think so many young people are just dealing with untold challenges. So these are not young people who are in the minority, but really most young people in our communities. So what do they need for this? We know that they need individual, relational, and contextual resources. And we also know that they do not need these resources in isolation of one another. These resources work best when they interact. And so from this, we know that resilience is actually a process that moves children and youth from spaces of very high risk and adversity, and that draws on the interaction of these three components of resources to result in good or better than expected outcomes. We know that individual assets include things like cognitive abilities, executive function, self-regulation, problem-solving skill, positive affect, etc., etc. And I'm going to talk a little bit more in a moment about agency and meaning-making frameworks. That's part of individual assets. And what's interesting is when we review the literature is the way in which they are part of the motor, if you like, that drives this resilience process. But I'm definitely going to talk about that more because I'm not putting this back on the shoulders of individual children and youth. But we know, and we know from this morning's presentations already, panel presentations, that these individual assets cannot be developed without the resources that come through relationships, especially, and contextual resources. So children and adolescents absolutely need secure, trusting, nurturing, caring, stable, accepting, and respectful relationships with others in order for these individual assets to develop effectively. And I think what's really important then, what gets lost sometimes in the way our services are structured, and especially the way in which our policies influence our services, is that these relationships can come from a multitude of places. And of course, the relationships provided with primary caregivers is essential, as is that from siblings and extended family. But I think as we move away from primary caregivers, other essential influences like siblings, extended family, peer group and friends, educators, mentors, other people in the community, I think they seem to disappear in service delivery. And we need to remember the importance of that. And I think oftentimes service providers themselves need to keep in mind the powerful role that they can play in, especially when they establish these kinds of relationships with young people. And then, of course, contextual resources. And here again, the full gamut are implicated in child and youth development. So again, I think education gets a lot of emphasis and a lot of spotlight shone on it in the importance of child and youth development, as it should, as with primary caregivers. But then again, I think as we move away from education, resources such as recreational resources, the importance of community cohesion, routine and structure, the socioeconomic factors at play in the communities in which families and education resources are embedded, service providers, opportunities for spirituality, religious engagement, cultural and civic engagement, all these kinds of resources tend to become invisible when we think about the elements that are required in supporting young people be happy and healthy. So I think, again, we need to just expand that spotlight a little bit. And if we think about all these aspects, we can see that resilience is a highly complex process within an organizational framework, and that developmental outcomes are determined by the interaction of so many factors, including genetic, biological, psychological, sociological factors, in a context of environmental support. And within this view, any constitutional or environmental factor may serve as a vulnerability, as a protective factor, as a risk variable, and can be operating directly or indirectly influencing young people's behavior. So I used to describe resilience as a little bit of a splat. It's like jello against a wall. You're just going to have to start digging and putting in the time and the effort to understand where the resources are and where the risks are, and to not come at this with some kind of framework, with a one-size-fits-all perspective, which again, I think a lot of the ways in which we implement our programs tend to come at things in such a uniform manner. They don't always account for the complexity of the contexts that children, youth, and their families are living in. I want to go back to that, the assets, the individual assets of meaning-making processes and agency just for a minute, because I think often we talk about resilience as a process, and it's a process that draws on individual relational and contextual factors. But we don't actually talk about how this process operates. What are the mechanisms driving it, and how do these mechanisms interact with one another? And while it might feel like we've gone off on a tangent here, I think understanding this becomes very important when we start considering what is community resilience and how do we enact that in order to promote better mental health outcomes for youth. So if we place individuals at the center of this process, given that they are at the center of the process, moving from risk to better than expected outcomes, we should remember that people function, interact with their environment by virtue of their meaning-making framework. How do I see the world and my place in it? How do I understand what's happening to me? And how do I use that framework on a daily basis to make decisions? So that's the meaning-making process that's operating on a daily basis. And how do I make decisions? How do I understand the events that I'm experiencing? How do I understand what I need to respond to these events and challenges? How these questions are answered very much shapes how people will enact their own agency. So sometimes we tend to say, well, if we just give a self-esteem workshop for children and youth, then they'll draw on their agency and they'll do better. Yes, the workshop's great, but we need to appreciate that this process at the center, or this mechanism at the center of the resilience process, is shaped right from birth, really. How babies are responded to by people in their environment starts to shape how they understand and make sense of the world and their place in it. And this, of course, persists across the lifespan. We bring our meaning-making frameworks and processes to an event that we give meaning to, that shapes how we understand the resources that we need to draw on and engage with. And of course, when we engage with resources, especially contextual and relational resources, then there is a response from our environment that either affirms these frameworks that we hold or challenges them. So when children have been brought into an environment where perhaps they're receiving messages that they're a burden, that they're a hassle, that maybe they're not wanted, and because of these things that they're bad and they don't have value, that starts to shape their framework, and it starts to shape how they're going to respond to events, the resources that they're going to draw on. And as their social world expands, if the feedback they're getting from these interactions confirms that they're bad, that they're unwanted, that they're a burden, of course that upholds their meaning-making framework. And you can see how this process and cycle perpetuates itself. But when young people can engage with resources, contextual and relational resources, where these frameworks are challenged, then we can start to reshape the meaning-making framework and process of young people, of children and adolescents, and reshape the way they engage with resources and the responses from them. Of course, in order to do this effectively, we need to start thinking about, I'm just skipping through some of these things in the interest of time, we need to start thinking about how young people see their world and their place in it, how they see their challenges. And I think we've heard a lot about this today, especially in our panel discussions around the importance of integrating children and adolescents in our decision-making processes. Of course, in a one-on-one situation, in a service provision situation, we need to start there as well. We need to understand what children and adolescents see as the resources that are available to them, in contrast to the resources that they think they do need. So what can they draw on, and how can we integrate especially contextual resources in learning experiences? So not just one-off workshops or curriculums that are implemented, but how can we extend on that in the day-to-day lives of young people, where on a daily basis they can have learning opportunities. But of course, to effectively extend these resources, we also need to work at better integrating services. So how are schools working with social workers, working with RCMP, working with mental health providers? And of course, we need to look at community development. So how does this young person have different learning experiences and different engagement with their environment when, for example, the guy who owns the corner store is maybe brought into case management and said, can you just maybe give this young person an opportunity, or can you give them feedback? They look up to you, for example. And of course, underpinning all of this is supportive policies that enable service providers to really get out into the community and work with each other and work with community, so that we can see that kind of integration and development. And flexible resource allocation. So, for example, this is a favorite example of mine, how can school spaces actually become recreational spaces outside of school hours? How can school libraries be extended to become public libraries, for example? I'm a bit of a dreamer. So I went through all that focus on resilience to really situate that individual child and youth resilience process within a bigger framework and the implications for service providers, but also for communities and for policymakers and people in legislation, to think about how can we rework and resituate resources, formal and informal resources, around young people in ways that effectively support mental health outcomes. So as I say, I think we've really heard a lot about this in the past few hours that the conference has been going. But when we think about resilience in this way, then I love Anne Maston's 2014 definition, where she explains resilience as the capacity of a dynamic system to adapt successfully to disturbances that threaten system function, viability, or development. So you can see how, as a child psychologist, she's moved completely from this focus on young people themselves, much more to a focus on the whole system that surrounds them. And I think that really is where our focus needs to be today with this dynamic system. So why community resilience? If we reflect on the resilience research focused on children and youth and their findings, we see that for mental health promotion and support, if we really want to do this effectively, it's going to take a community approach. And moreover, I include service providers and policymakers and funders and government in this notion of community. The lovely thing with community resilience is that its strengths and asset-based. So we start with what's working in communities, what's going well, and how can we expand on that. Through this work, it works to prevent mental disorders and challenges and mitigate instances where there is already onset, and simultaneously to promote mental health promotion. Additionally, through this approach, we can better ensure that there are more enduring supports for children, youth, and their families, as well as the services that are working with them across the lifespan. I think currently what we see, we heard about this morning as well, what we see is that people engage in formal service provision, they reach out for help, they work through programs, and especially we were talking about a residential program. When people leave these programs and go back to their community, the supports fall away. And so when we look at community resilience, when we look at bolstering communities themselves, we can provide more enduring supports. So an approach like this can be used effectively in response to many of the challenges communities are facing today, including intergenerational trauma, chronic socioeconomic marginalization, and certainly the growing gap that we see between people struggling economically and people who are extremely affluent financially. We can use these approaches to deal with growing political, economic, and environmental insecurities. And of course, now added to the list, a current and post-COVID reality and the challenges that we're facing there. As we were dealing with our technical issues, I was thinking what a powerful reminder this was of how fragile our social connections are and how hard we have to work at keeping these. So I just need to stop here for a moment and just provide a warning, because I think, again, we are at risk of having this term community resilience co-opted and communities assessed and found wanting if they're not doing well despite the challenges they're facing. And so I draw on Kreitzman and McKnight here that a focus on assets and communities and ways to strengthen resilience promoting resources does not imply that communities do not need additional resources from the outside. Rather, outside resources will be much more effective if used by local community. I have a lot of typos in this. I'm sorry. I need to fix this. Used much more effectively if local community itself is fully mobilized and invested. And if communities themselves can define the agenda for which additional resources must be obtained. So stepping away from a one-size-fits-all model. And I think going back to, again, what we've heard a lot of this morning, that actually local leadership, so be it chief and council or municipalities, local leadership needs to sit squarely behind how resources are being allocated because of their connection to the community, their on-the-ground engagement with issues, and serve as a conduit back to provincial and federal government in the allocation of resources. And as promised, another warning from Margaret Wheatley: everything has become quite complicated in our communities. Things that were simple have become a technique. And once processes become a technique, it can only grow more complex. So I really don't want to provide techniques here today. And difficult. It becomes the specialized knowledge of a few experts, and we've become suspicious of anything that looks too easy. And those of us who have technical expertise become especially suspicious of these easy solutions. So I'm hoping that what I present to you today does not look simple and that sells itself as a technique, but that fundamentally when you walk away, you take the take-home message of this is about common sense and social connections and inclusivity. Again, lots of words we've been hearing all through today and heard last night, and that this is about building communities. I didn't add this into my slides because I was reading this last night. But again, Margaret Wheatley says, there is no power for change greater than a community discovering what it cares about. And I think this is the crux of what I want to share with you today. And I've spent way too much time on all of this. And I was going to share with you the story of Eskasoni because really it is what has happened in that community that has inspired the direction that my work has taken. And it is the wisdom of the young people that I'm so honored to work with there that has really driven the direction of focusing on community resilience. But suffice to say, their mental health service provider listened to a community in response to the unfortunate wave of suicides, increase in suicides that they experienced in 2008 and 2009. And it was at a community organized event that the director of mental health services realized that everything they were doing was wrong. And she threw the mental health service provision rule book out of the window and integrated what they were hearing from community into their work. And suffice to say, they realized that their service provision mirrored a lot of what we know about service provision today. It was siloed. There were barriers to accessing service provision. And of course, people who really needed community-based mental health resources were falling through the cracks and were reflecting that in a very loud manner. And they realized that they needed help. And what they did was they extended themselves to achieve this help. I can't dwell on this too long. They have established what they've called a fishing net model, and we've written about this, and it is available. I've made it available through Hoover, and I've seen it. It's there. You can access it. So they've created a fishing net model, and really what they've done is enhanced community development to create better community strengths that basically what they've done is positioned the community as their primary client and worked to strengthen the social connections within the community to provide better primary resources to families and individuals within the community to promote mental health. And then as people need it, they can literally swim through this social net that has been created and is still being strengthened and created, and access more targeted mental health services as necessary. And they've done this by amalgamating these services within Scotia Mental Health Services, but also working to collaborate and cooperate and integrate better with other services in the community. So Mi'kmaq Child and Family Services, the schools, the RCMP, really working hard to collaborate with other service providers. It's not foolproof, it's not perfect, but they're absolutely driven to do that and to work as far as possible around the barriers that prevent that collaboration. What I find most inspiring in their work is their community-based out-of-office service model that they use. And I'm not going to go into this in detail, as I say, it's in the chapter that I've shared. It isn't scanned fabulously, but it's there. But drawing on passion projects. So in the introductions, I asked everybody to mention things that they really enjoy doing. And Kathy Leslie, if I could use you as an example, you're in community health promotion and you love swimming. And so you can see even from the slides here that staff within Scotia Mental Health Services think about their passions and how they can use that to create programming in the community to strengthen community networks. And then, of course, within that as well, they slip in, unbeknownst to the young people participating, for example, in the surf program, aspects that they help build in young people. And it's not a sit-down workshop kind of thing. It's just slipped in there very subtly. So as Daphne says, people are engaged in mental health promotion work, but they're having so much fun they don't even realize it. So things like stigma get dealt with in these really effective ways. So if going back to Kathy, you enjoy swimming and you wish you could build a more peaceful way, a more peaceful world, how could we integrate a swimming program in a community that maybe addresses aspects such as friendship and bullying? But we don't talk about bullying because that puts energy into it. We talk about friendship. That sucks the air out of bullying. That's another approach that gets used in Scotia. So their Pink Day, for example, isn't called, their Pink T-shirt Day isn't about bullying. It's about promoting friendship. It's a knit-up day. So redirecting focus and drawing on people's passions to promote this kind of, to support the development of positive issues in the community. And then, of course, they do organize more formal workshops to address communities' health perception through activities and celebrations. So reconnecting young people with traditional activities such as drum making, but also using opportunities, for example, like Halloween, to create community activities where we can facilitate intergenerational connection and new peer group connections, these kinds of ideas. So just how do we get people out of their houses and talking to each other and doing it in a positive environment and a happy environment where people can just realize, as one young man said in a research project we did a few years ago, I've realized through all this fun we've been having that Scotia is actually a great place to live. And you think that's really fabulous when young people can feel that way about their community. Okay, so now I've talked myself almost completely out of time. Patsy, how are we doing? According to my clock, we've been at it for 45 minutes.
Right. And we have, we're going to get bumped off at about 4:15. There's another meeting that's scheduled on this, but it's right now you're good. So you can take a few more minutes, and it's really up to the people in the room. It's we had said we'd be done earlier than this in the day, so is everyone okay to stay for a few more minutes?
I would love to stay, Patsy. It's Kathy, but I have to go to the office and make sure that all the mover things have been out. And of course, I booked it for today because I thought we were going to be done at 3:30. So I just have to get there before 4:30. I'll watch it all. This is all recorded, right?
It is.
Yeah. All right. And I'll see you in the morning, Chantal.
See you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
How are others doing?
Anybody else have to go? Okay, why don't
I can
you?
speak for a few more.
Yep. Okay. Why don't you wrap up what your key message is, and we'll listen.
Okay. So, I mean, you have the slides, so I think I'm going to skip through a lot of this. But for me, community resilience mirrors a lot of what we've learned about child and youth resilience. It's about building and developing the resources in and around communities that are relevant to community needs. And of course, it's not a static process. This is something that's constantly in a state of flux. We're changing to needs all the time. Lawrence Kermeyer and his team say it really well. Community resilience is the dynamics of the social response to damage or destroy the community, these social connections and networks. These dynamics may involve adaptations and adjustments of individuals, groups, and organizations with the community, seen as components of the community as a system, as well as interactions with the whole community, with its surrounding environment, especially other social, economic, and political entities. So, as I say, just as with child and youth resilience, community resilience is complex and it involves a lot of moving parts, which can be quite overwhelming, especially if we're talking about promoting community resilience. And here again, I draw my inspiration from Scotia Mental Health Services. How did a small community-based organization that, as some of you may know, struggles with funding, is stuck in fighting funding cycles, operating on an oil rag, basically, in terms of money that's available to them. How did they step outside of their mandate while the community was in crisis and shift things? And as I say, the team themselves will say it's not perfect, there are problems in this, but they've made incredible strides. So this is something that I've been looking at with a team of international researchers for about the past year. And what we've seen is that, again, this is about drawing on various resources that to varying degrees are available to communities. So natural capital, what's in the environment naturally around a community, economic and built capital, human capital is a huge one, cultural capital, and that's really understanding, especially if you're a service provider embedded within a community, for example, a school or mental health service provider. Cultural capital really is about understanding those systemic issues that challenge communities, that mean that communities are often stuck in a certain place by virtue of the systemic challenges facing it, systemic racism, systemic economic marginalization, aspects such as that. It's understanding the history of the community and the challenges communities have had to face, so as to respond in a more sensitive and well-aligned manner. And then, of course, social capital. These are the kinds of resources that can be drawn on. And I've lost my notes here, and so I need to go back to them, otherwise I'm going to jabber on too much. So community resilience comprises these 5 capitals. These 5 resources of capital support community resilience as an adaptive and transformative process, again, that manifests in social supports and social cohesion, underpinned by effective social networking. I need to use the mouse, social networking and collaboration that collectively engages and activates social mechanisms or levers necessary to establish relevant and accessible resources for children, and contextual and physical resources for children and youth and their families, social, emotional, or relational supports, for children and youth as well as their families, and opportunities for meaningful child and youth engagement in their civic, social, and cultural context. So those relationships that can challenge meaning-making frameworks and develop healthy meaning-making frameworks. And also, we've heard this morning again about opportunities for youth engagement. For example, municipal advisory panels and such stuff. It's really important that that engagement is authentic and that the feedback children and youth give on these panels is taken seriously and that it's not tokenism. So how do we foster community resilience? As I said previously, this is not a static space. This is a non-cyclical, non-linear process that can get quite chaotic, but it's definitely something that's situated within specific contexts and cultures, and that needs to be taken into account all the time to engage in this process. At the center of this process is adaptive capacity. And really, this is the capacity of actors in a system, so people like mental health service providers or teachers that draw on these capitals, these 5 capitals that exist in the community, to work through social networks and establish learning communities, integrating an asset-based approach that, again, in Scotia is termed a grow your own approach, develop skills and interests that exist there, that can foster community resilience. So I've got this whole complicated, this is my trying to keep everybody's interest in this, make it really complicated. This is really a visual representation of adaptive capacity. But essentially what we're seeing here, if I can get my mouse onto the screen, is that a group of people within a community, for example, teachers and school administrators, decide that they need to do things differently. And they assess the social capital, which in this case, for example, would be schools. What are the resources that they have there and then in the school that they can draw on, that they can use to enhance, expand, leverage, and use community capacities? So start integrating those community capacities back in with what they're doing. By just starting with the small space, who are we, what's the issue we're facing, what are the resources that we have here and now to draw on so that we can start to enhance community capacities. They put a cycle, implement a spiral, an upward spiral of investment that eventually means they can start drawing on human capital, so stakeholders, which would be people like community leadership, other community members, other service providers. How can they be engaged in this process? Political capital, so community leadership, organizations and other service organizations that have access to the kind of policy, political and funding change that needs to be drawn on to support this process. And then, of course, cultural capital. So this is the knowledge needed to enact and demonstrate cultural competence and social status. And here I said, understand historical and inequities that underpin the dynamics of a community in a moment. All of this needs to be drawn on, and that creates this bigger spiral that develops community capacity and community resilience. So the core message of that complicated slide is start where you're at with what you have and work outwards from there. So if we want to establish positive child and adolescent mental health and well-being as an organization, as somebody working in the sector, this is the important place to start. What do we see that's needed or that's missing to support this? What are the local needs that exist around child and adolescent mental health being? And what are the existing resources and networks that we can draw on? How can we use these resources and networks to respond to these needs? So how can we draw on existing resources? How can we draw on formal and informal networks? Who knows who that has what we need to be able to start responding to local needs in order to support child and mental health well-being? And from there to develop community events and workshops. So going back to Scotia Mental Health Services, not only do they have fun community events like Halloween events, but they also have workshops in place. So they're a mental health service provider, but they'll run workshops in terms of home budgeting. So how does a family that's where each person's living on less than $4 a day, how do they survive at the end of the month? How do you cook healthy meals on that kind of budget? So they'll run cooking workshops. And in a COVID world, they'll start doing a lot of this online through their Facebook page. So what's out there? Who do we know who has access to the resources that we can draw on to start integrating into community events and workshops? And as part of this, you can start looking at issues of reclaiming space. So what areas in the community have become sort of abandoned by the community or further marginalized by the community because of what goes on there? For example, substance abuse, or marginalized groups such as the members of the LGBTQ2+ community. Where do we need to reclaim space? Where do we need to find inclusivity? Where do we need to reestablish connections? How can we use these events and workshops for place-based education? So how can we integrate volunteers, for example, into setting up a big Halloween event where young people can maybe gain artistic skills or carpentry skills that they can then make use of throughout the year in other ways, perhaps to earn money? How can we use these events to ensure that we get feedback and communication on what else is going on in the community that's working or that is needed so that we can start to respond to that? And how can we use these events and workshops to develop new informal support networks? But of course, as Scotia Mental Health has taught us, how do we do all of this in a fun way that people don't feel like, oh, this is a self-esteem building workshop and I really don't want to be here because I have no self-esteem. So how do we do these things in fun ways that people want to be at, that they want to be engaged with, so that we can increase individual resilience promoting resources, so especially those relational and contextual resources and personal strengths. And of course, how do we use these kind of events where we're focusing on reclaimed space, place-based education, feedback communication, and support network development to feed back into what are our local needs and what existing resources and networks do we have that we can draw on to feed back into this? And how do we gradually grow these networks across the community?
So Linda,
yes.
yeah, I don't know if you're about close to wrap up, but you probably have a couple of minutes, and you may want to, there may be questions you'd like people to send email responses to. I'm not sure how you want to close up.
Yeah. So basically, just to come back to Margaret Wheatley, simplicity has a powerful ally. Common sense, good solutions are always simple. And so please don't think of this slide as a technique, but rather just a very loose blueprint that people can take and then morph into very contextual community-based needs. And so, yes, that's basically it. I was just hoping that there would be time for people to actually do some of those steps in their heads and give feedback on the kinds of opportunities that they were realizing exist in the community, resources, but also what are the limitations or barriers to doing something like this, or that needs to be changed, and any other feedback. And of course, questions. So
I'm just thinking, Linda, there's so much material there, and it would be a good exercise in terms of that last diagram, just to take a community that you live in and try to imagine it through. And if you had the 90 minutes, you probably could have your slides and give people a good 20 minutes to try to think about how you'd apply it, right?
Yeah, yeah. So
yeah, some homework for tonight, maybe.
That's what I was going to say. Homework for everyone. Take that slide and start thinking about what are the issues, community-based issues, what are the existing resources that we can build on, but not just drawing these immediately available resources. How do we actually use this process to develop more resources? And then my email address is there. And of course, I'm in the Hoover group. So if anybody would like to chat more about this, send emails, would be wonderful.
Okay, any closing comments from the group, I think, and then we got about 3 minutes before the next meeting. So it has time though for a comment to Linda.
Hi, it's Denise. Just listening today, and of course knowing, because I do a lot of on the ground work with families and students and dealing with people who are in deep trauma. I mean, academia aside and all, there's a component that, as community members, we discuss, amongst ourselves, and it has to do with dignity. And there's a lot of shame with mental health. There's a lot of shame with poverty. There's a lot of, issues that people don't consider when they're having to go for resources, that it's getting over that barrier of being able to go and ask for help and, to acknowledge that you need help. I'm not seeing a lot, and I would love to know what your thoughts are. I guess inspire our youth and our children to be able to take ownership in that, that there's a dignified way of doing this where they're empowered without having to think there's something wrong with themselves. So, and I know I deal with that a lot with students at school because, there's the stigma of having to go and get help. And then, outside, I mean, I could show them all kinds of, charts and forms, but real life applications. How do we take that down to the youth and the children too, and to really empower them in taking ownership, and also knowing that it's a dignified process, I guess.
Exactly. Oh, Denise, I think, are you in Halifax?
Yes, I am.
Oh, fabulous. Well, you and I need to go have coffee.
Okay.
But given that we're focusing on community resilience here, I'll answer from that perspective. But I do think your question actually needs a dual response, because the fact of the matter is that right here, right now, there are young people who are really, really struggling, and we don't necessarily have time to wait for community to start changing the narrative. But I think that is part of, in the internal review that, for example, Scotia Mental Health Services did in 2010, that was a big issue that they came up against. They realized people who really needed the help weren't accessing it because of exactly these issues. And so that's why their mental health delivery staff are the ones who are doing things like running the surf program or the fishing program, so that young people, and I should add to that, sorry, that they really have their pulse on, it's not perfect, but they really do have their pulse on who are the young people in the community who are struggling. And so they do targeted invitations to these fun things, like, oh, come join the cultural fishing program. So nothing to do with mental health, or the gaming program. And they try and establish connections that way. But they also realize that despite these efforts, they are clearly still missing. They're not getting to all the people they need to get to. They're also doing a lot of stuff in the community to try and deal with stigma around mental health services. They've been at it for 10 years and they're still struggling, right? There's still a lot of stigma and shame around this. But I think that realization that we have to work at a community level as well. And we have to change the way the access points to mental health service provision. We have to shift that. But as I said, that.
You know what, Linda? I'm thinking that you two really need to have a longer conversation. We could all benefit from your conversation, but we really do have to close off because I know that this is going to bump off. I booked another meeting for 4:20, so it's going to happen, and I'd rather it not happen rudely. So it's not like the breakout rooms where you get zoomed off. It'll just be that. But I want to thank you very much, and I think. Denise, you have her email address, so the two of you can connect, and also on the community board or tomorrow have, when you get in, or even tonight. That's the thing, you don't have to wait till tomorrow to communicate on who, but it's open all night. I'm not that you really want to be doing that all night, but you know what I mean. It is there, so you can connect, and I hope you do. I want to thank everybody for their patience with all of the technical problems that we had. Like I say, it's the first time we've ever done this, and we've discovered that the presenters have been wonderful in terms of adapting. So we moved over to WebEx, and there's one group that's on Zoom at York University, another one at New Brunswick Department of Education, and we're all over the place right now. So anyway, thank you very much, and I hope you have a good night's sleep, and we'll see you tomorrow, Linda, and hopefully your presentation tomorrow will be so smooth. You'll know exactly what's going on. All right, you built resilience today. Okay, take care.
Thanks, Patsy.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.